wanted to ask you all a question, and Lisa, it came up in your presentation when you said housing is a human right. And I want to start with you. Do you think in LA and California and the United States, we really believe that housing is a human right? As you might, but the bigger we.
Unfortunately, we do not have in the United States, I don't think that there is a firm belief because we have not passed that as a basic human right. Even the state of California doesn't have that as a basic human right. Some states do have a basic right to shelter, but only very few. So I think when we talk about housing as a human right, it is recognized on some levels in a global sense, but we have to do a lot better in recognizing, because it's part of, obviously it's part of how we keep people oppressed in our society, right? But unfortunately, I think in general, if you were to ask people, just like in general, if you ask, should women get equal rights? They would say yes. But do we have the ERA? No. And I think the same thing about with human rights. And if you ask people, should people be housed? They would say yes. Yet we don't have that. Housing is a right.
Thank you, and I think you're right. There was an interesting report, I think it was by the Democracy Collaborative, and it was looking at human rights and how they operate in the United States. And because you're right, I think in a global sense, human rights and the human rights framework has been there for a long time, the United Nations. And so I want to pick up on that for the other panelists, Aziza and Lucia. How have you found the human rights frames or frameworks helpful in your work? And what do you find most challenging as you're trying to assure every human being the rights that you feel they believe just because they were born and they're human?
Okay. And I think that people can agree, like you said, to a theory that we're all equal and we all have rights. And then when it comes to how we really see the value of a human being, that's where we get tested. And for me, the biggest challenge is there's all these great, important safeguards, like the mayor making statements, the city attorney being on board with all these really important initiatives, the new commission that was created for civil and human rights, all these things, right, that we're doing to protect. And ultimately, what's really essential is having that contact and giving enough time to something. And we're so focused on the bottom line and just moving things forward that we forget to fully see the human being in front of us. And I know that sounds abstract, and I see it time and time again where we want to cut a conversation short just to get to the end. And we have lost a really important opportunity to get to the strongest part of democracy.
Thank you. Lucia?
I think I think there's a couple of things. I think the biggest challenge, I think one of the things that Aziza talked about was the base, right? We talk about relationship, and none of us built that. A lot of people kind of close their, and this is not just talking about a certain circle, but you kind of when you start thinking about human rights, just you were saying, Lisa was saying, it's yeah, you ask anybody, right? I work in immigration, and I'm well, does every asylum, should get, every asylum seeker that comes in, should they get asylum? Absolutely. But a lot of people, I think for my work, there was that challenge of well, they're coming from outside, right? And there's all these topics that we talk about. And again, I brought it up when we talk about climate migration, right? And oh, the climate crisis, it has nothing to do with immigration. It's well, do we know the history of the US, right? Do we know that the US goes into all these other countries and began these all these wars, and this is why people continue to migrate? And I think that's the biggest challenge. So we are not talking about the bottom line of this, which is if people are migrating, or just folks that are looking for certain rights and we're fighting for it, have we had this conversation at home? Are we having, I think within immigration there is a conversation of anti-blackness, right? And within the Latinx community and every other community there's POC. Are we having these conversations at home? Homelessness, are we talking about this while I'm at a bar? with a friend, and we're in California, we're in LA, our folks, you're passing a joint. Are you talking about this while you're getting high? I mean, like, I'm just being real, right? Like, folks are not having these conversations. So it really starts, I think the biggest challenge to me is when I see everyone being like, well, I support, I go vote, and I go do this, but are you really having, again, these conversations at the center where you need to be having it? It doesn't mean because you go to a rally, you're supporting it and you're making a change. It doesn't mean because you're donating, because a lot of people tell me all the time, oh, I'm donating to RAICES. And I'm like, yeah, but that's not enough. It is one thing, but if you're not, I think a lot of folks, if you're not having this conversation, and I want to be repetitive about this, if you're not having this conversation at home with the closest folks, you can't create a change anywhere if you're not having a pinpoint somewhere.
So what would it look like for each of you if the human right that you have been fighting for your careers would be realized?
I love that because I think it's like the imagine a world, right? So if I could imagine a world where all people were treated with the dignity and respect, that we no longer had to walk aside or walk over somebody, that there was nobody left on a street or released from a hospital, that human beings were more connected, that there we go back, or maybe there was never a time period, but in a lot of countries, what I've heard over and over again when I visit is like, how could, like, there's no family member, there's nobody that could take someone in? There's no one at all? Like, you would leave someone out on the street? And I think about that a lot, because in those countries it's changed too. 20 years ago when I visit and they say those things, some of those countries now have homeless people, right? So if we went back, if we had that time where people were more connected, and I think that would change a lot of things, not just more people being housed, but it would change a lot of our human rights issues, right? So engaging in that conversation. I love this story, and taking the time to really get to know and care about one another.
So for me, it would look like partnership. Real, genuine partnership. Where we see value in each other and we're working towards a shared goal, and the realization or like the willingness to say that being in partnership means that it's going to be hard. It means that we are committed to having not only the difficult conversations, but that when we have those disagreements, we know they're coming. Like, I have them with my husband, I have them with my sister, I have them, like, that's relationship. But that we see relationship as and the willingness to dive into those hard moments as opportunities to be clearer with each other on like what we need, and to seek greater clarity from other people around us. But it would look like everybody in the conversation having both the space and the ability to express themselves and be strong. Like, one of my solid triggers, which comes from experience, is that there's this thing where we want to go in and we want to tell a story about like the hero complex. And the thing is it's not just about heroes, it's actually about partners standing up and saying like, we're both working together on this, and we both offer value to this community, and we work together with other people to make this a better place.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to you for something, but Lucia, how about you?
I feel like you said most of what I was going to say. I think one, for sure, partnerships. I think I go back to like my field and immigration. I think for us, we're living in a Trump era. And we're living in a time where, and I'm gonna get very racial with this, but it does for I think for every fight, but in a lot of like social justice movements, but I think for immigration is really looking at two things, right? Like looking at more folks that are allies, allyship, right? Allyship is one of the things that I think that if that was more of a strong partnership, then I think a lot of things would change. Specifically, I think in the time that we're living. I think years have gone and we've seen different things, but I think allyship is one big huge thing. And I think the second one is like really noticing, like talking about privilege and like where does your privilege come from and where do you stand with your privilege? How are you using? I think every day I ask myself, I was undocumented and now I'm a formerly undocumented person. How does my privilege help the rest of my community? My brother is still undocumented. How do I help him even though I'm far away, right? And it's not just him, it's everyone around me and everybody in my community that continues to not have papers. How do I help that? And so I think this doesn't have to be about white folks that can't put their bodies on the line, because there's a bunch of folks that help, at least in my life, that have helped me that are white and that have decided to be like, you know what, you are also privileged, but I have a skin color that will lead me to be able to change things. And I think I call out all the time that I'm saying, if you're a white person and you're putting your body on the line, whether that means you're, taking every weekend and showing up by translating or little stuff, then you're creating change. But I do think that in immigration, it comes down to that, where you're asking yourself, where is your privilege? And I think for a lot of like social justice movement, it's where is your privilege? How are you using your privilege to create change, right? And also knowing like, where do you stand, right? Do you need to be I think one of the words that I saw during today was, where are you on the front lines? Like, you don't need to be on the front lines to be able to like help out, right? Your allyship does not mean that you have to be in the screen. That's not what I do. I'm also comms, so I'm behind the scenes majority of the time. So I think the word that I want folks to take away from my answer is allyship. Where do you take allyship?
Thank you. Aziza, can I ask you how you got into the work that you did? We heard Lucia's sort of personal story, and I am the daughter of Egyptian immigrants, and so Muslim-Jewish relationship is like something that Egyptians need to do, and and Jewish folks need to do. But how did you get into the work? May I ask? You can say no if you want to.
No, thank you. I was kind of born into it. My mother is Caucasian, so I'm part of the demographics that I share. So my mom is Caucasian, my dad is Palestinian, and I remember growing up in Jordan, and we would come to the U.S. for the summers, and there was this. So Jordan, and when I was growing up, Israel hadn't signed the peace accords yet, and America was closer than crossing that border. It wasn't possible, and I had never met anyone who was Jewish other than the people in military fatigues on my television screen. And so I had a very specific fear towards Jews. And so I remember when the peace accords got signed in 1990s, 94, and I was the first group to go across the border as part of my school. And when I made that choice, I made a choice that really upset a lot of people that I was close to. And what made it possible for me to cross that border was my dad, who's the Palestinian refugee, who said, sometimes you have to put one foot in front of the other and go see for yourself. And that has opened up my life to a whole different thing of both the difficulty and the importance of working through it and the beauty that comes at the end.
Thank you. Lisa, how did you stumble into the Downtown Women's Center line of work?
Well, I think that answer changes a lot because kind of as my life has unfolded, I have a better understanding, right, of why, because homeless, people becoming unhoused, it happens, it's just kind of the symptom, the end of all these other problems, whether it's the racism that exists, our failure of prison systems, educational systems, so many other failures. And I didn't realize at the time I had been with the YWCAs for many years on a local and national level, and I didn't realize that one day I was in the center and a woman was telling me her story, and I knew my father was always like a big storyteller, but he was Irish, and but I also knew that it didn't always make sense, that he didn't know that the difference sometimes between a lie and a reality. And it was the first time when I was working in the residence, when I had first began one night, that this woman told me she was like leaving, and she came back a half an hour later and told me she had just gone to Griffith Park and went horseback riding and did these other things. And I was like, only half an hour. And then I saw her again, and she told me another long story, and I was like, oh, she has, I don't know what it is, but these are the same stories that I grew up with all my life with my dad. And I always thought I was there because my parents were teenage parents, We grew up with a lot of support from my grandmother. And I always thought that I was there. My grandma still thought to the day that she died that she caused the death of her mother because her mother chose to buy her a prescription instead of getting a winter jacket, and died of pneumonia. So I always thought I was doing the work for my grandmother. But it was interesting to know that I'm doing the work also for my family and learning more. It's made me much closer to my father.
Thank you. Do I have time for one more question for the panel? Yeah. Okay, great. So now you guys have all painted, you ladies have all painted a vision of kind of what it would look like and what would be the operative word, allyship, partnership, and a world without homelessness and solving many solutions along the way. But as you think about the topic of this exhibit that Taji Terasaki has beautifully put together, which is challenging borders, both visible and invisible, what do you think is the next border or frontier that you think needs to be confronted either by you or through advocacy in the work that you do?
The border of democracy disappearing based on Trump. And that needs to come down to stop. That's the next frontier. That's my immediate frontier.
Thank you.
Immediate border.
I feel this urgency, like this urgency of like, we have so much work to do and we have to get all hands on deck right now. And I can't, so part of my upbringing, I mentioned Jordan, Kansas is really a big part of who I am. And my sister came home one day and her face was flushed red. And when Annie's face is red, it is not good. And so I was like, what's going on? And like the tears just kept falling down and she wouldn't say anything. And then she finally said that a teacher in her classroom said something about Arabs. And to this day, I can't tell you what he said, but I know exactly how we felt. We felt like we didn't belong. We felt like we had no place. And no matter how good we were never gonna have a space that was honored at this table. And so my mom came home, and to her credit, like she had a completely different reaction. I was feeling stuck. My mom said, we're going to go talk to the teacher tomorrow. That's what she did. Call it white privilege, call it whatever. That's what she did. And she walked into that school the next day and she said, my baby's hurting, can you see her pain? And to his credit, the teacher said, I see her pain. And he started asking Annie questions and drawing out the stories and trying to understand better. And he realized that he had really hurt his student. And I think that we put our students in a position, and I know this actually from the numbers, that like they all of a sudden have to represent all of Latino America, Latin America, they have to represent all of Islam, they have to represent all of Hinduism, and it's not okay for a fifth grader to answer those questions. And so I think that's actually really important to make sure that our teachers and our educators and our leaders are really more aware of how their actions and not preparing enough are impacting our most vulnerable communities. And this teacher eventually became a huge ally of our family. And he had me come back to Kansas and literally he's now the principal of the school. And I told him all about my work. And I think that's the frontier that we have to conquer, is the one where we look at the pain right in the eye and we say, this is our vulnerable community. There's another story that we're going to weave and we're going to weave it together.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lucia.
And that's why I talk about allyship, because it works. I think for me, there's two things, right? I think a lot of the border of democracy, what Lisa was saying. I also think a lot about the undocumented community and in my work, how do you break that? And I get very emotional when I talk about this because I always think back of my brother, right? And like his status hasn't changed. And what does that mean for my brother? And what does that mean? I live in a mixed status family, but I think the biggest thing that I always see when I talk to him is, what do I need to break, or how do I make these changes? And the biggest thing that he always tells me is, I think you just need to talk to more people with love. And when he tells me that, because I'm very confrontational, I stop and I think, you're right, but how do I do that when I have all this anger that I have to release? And I think I go back to a lot of the doñas and the dons and all these, like, you know, folks that work in the street now that I live here in LA. And I talk to them, and I want to get, you know, their opinion, and they're always telling me like the same thing. They're always telling me like, you know, sometimes it's really hard to hold on to pain and know how you let go of that pain. But again, it really is going down to like, how do you treat something with love without being hurt? But also, how do you treat something so hard when you're being attacked all the time, where you're being attacked due to your race, due to the way you identify of your sexuality, or, you know, even if you're same gender-wise, like how you identify with that. And again, the answer always becomes love. So I think for me is, how do I treat a lot of the attacks that we're currently taking, and I'm learning that right now, with love, but also how do I go into educators and telling them like, hey, sometimes what you're saying or what you're doing is hurting other people, without me being like, hey, you're like messing up this, you know, and all this stuff, because we do it all the time. We do it all the time. I do it all the time. And I think also, I think in my generation, we get labeled as that. We get labeled as, you're an attacker, you love to like, I mean, and the short story is, I recently, in Vegas, I interrupted Biden with my coworker, right? And after I did that, I had literally folks from the progressive side coming in attacking me, like, how could you, you know, and not to get political, but how can you attack this man and all that stuff? And I was trying to figure out, how do I break those borders, right? How do I break that border to letting them know, like, this man has deported friends of mine, like on a personal level, right? How do I break that, and how do I not? And I learned, some of these people I just have to let go, and I just can't change them. But if I can, I will do it with love. And that sounds cheesy, but it is something, it's the biggest way that I'm now learning.
Very regenerative in this work. It can be very draining. I think with that, I'm not getting any signals with time, but I have, thank you. I think that with that, I'd like to ask that everyone give one last round of applause to this tremendous panel of women.